Welcome to the show both feared and revered by man and beast, the Helios blog. Today an Israel-Iran debate. That should be good.
The reason she's alone is because she's difficult.
Women are not accepting the bare minimum.
Women fuck men they respect.
All the women who say things like, I'm strong, independent, I don't need no man, like, y'all impress me.
Women just gaslight each other and say what they want to hear.
Horrible atrocities.
Do we really need this distorted lecture?
Mr. Morris, you are not the moderator. Piers Morgan is the moderator.
I have never said anything about millions of Iranians. This is pure nonsense.
Professor Morris!
You do seem oddly keen to defend Iran.
He said that we can't trust Iran. You're such a shameless liar.
As we recall this debate, the world is still waiting for an Iranian attack on Israel. Ayatollah Khamenei says that Iran has a duty to take revenge after Israel assassinated Hamas chief Ismail Haniyeh inside Tehran and killed the top Hezbollah commander in Beirut. Whatever form that response takes, Israel's proxy war with Iran is in danger of becoming a direct and deadly conflict. And whatever happens over the coming days and weeks, the big questions remain the same. Both Israel and Iran see each other as an existential threat. So who has provoked who in the fractious decades since the Iranian Revolution? Does war with a common enemy strengthen Israel's alliances in the Middle East and beyond? And what is the future for a besieged Palestine as the world's gaze turns to geopolitical war games? My two guests are authoritative voices with deeply contrasting views on the historical context and a moral framing of a perilous moment for the world's peace. Many of you repeatedly asked us to bring them together, and I'll be joined in a moment by political scientist Norman Finkelstein and the eminent Israeli historian Benny Morris. But first, I'm joined by the former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. Mr. Bennett, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Where are we in this war? Because it seems to the outside world that we could be on the precipice of a much wider war in the Middle East, which could have catastrophic consequences.
Well, this wider war has been waged by Iran for the better time of 30 years, of the past 30 years, because Iran has developed a very smart strategy of creating an octopus of terror whose head is in Tehran, sending its tentacles all across the Middle East, to Iraq, to Yemen, to Lebanon, to Hamas, and building these proxy armies that serve Iran by creating chaos, hitting Western targets, and targeting Israel as well. So this war has been waged on a one-sided basis. The new part is that Israel is hitting back.
You said that Israel has a duty to punish Iran for what it's been doing. What should that look like? What is punishment? I mean, do you believe eventually that Iran needs to be toppled completely? Is that not something that, again, would lead to a stratospherically bigger problem?
My lord, may you not live to see interesting times. Sadly, 2024 seems to be very interesting times indeed.
Quite the contrary. I believe that the Iranian regime has to be toppled. Iran's regime, the Iranian Islamic Republic of Iran, is the epicenter of terror. It's the source of about 80% of the terror in the Middle East and beyond, of the chaos. And it's destined to fall. It reminds me a bit of the USSR in the 80s. It's a corrupt, old, unconnected regime, incompetent, despised by its people. This regime will fall. The Iranian people will be free again. The question is how soon? Will it be in 2 years, 5 years, or 30 years? And I believe that the West, by taking action, especially economic action, can accelerate the demise of this horrible regime and bring a much better future to the Middle East and the world.
Israel obviously has been extremely active in the last week in taking...
Isn't this guy like a former... oh, he said president. Oh, is this the guy that was president when Iran wasn't so extremist? Interesting.
Out senior people from Hamas and Hezbollah. By doing that, you will have known that you would have retaliation. How big do you think that retaliation is likely to be?
I think we're confusing cause and result, because we are fighting back on a war that they started. And in your introduction, you talked about it almost as a symmetric situation, but it's not. We have no issue whatsoever with any of our neighbors. We don't want to dispose of them. We don't want to annihilate them. But Iran wants to annihilate Israel. Hamas wants to annihilate Israel. Hezbollah wants to annihilate Israel. So what we're doing is a defensive war against Iran.
Did I get this wrong? This guy's guy from Israel, and the same talking point has been mentioned. You remember last time we heard the Rabbi Shmuley guy, how he said that Israel's fighting a defensive war? Well, here we go again.
Against its proxies, in order to defend ourselves, and by the way, protect the West from this big wave of radical jihadic terror. It's a wave that we are, Israel in a sense is the wave breaker in the middle, that in a sense is defending the West from this wave. We have really no choice. When someone says we want to annihilate you, shoots rockets and arms about 7 different proxies to kill you, you got to fight until you win, and that's what we're going to do.
You talk about fighting till you win. Israel's been fighting now for many, many months against Hamas in Gaza, and yet there's no sign of the total victory, which Prime Minister Netanyahu vowed to be successful in achieving. When is that victory going to come? What would it look like, victory over Hamas? And what is the future in Gaza?
From my perspective, victory is a simple thing. It's Hamas surrendering, raising a white flag, releasing the terrorists, and us taking all the Hamas leaders and fighters, putting them on a ship and shipping them away from Gaza. And then we can begin rebuilding a new Gaza. That's what victory looks like. That's what we should be shooting for.
So here we go again. Same talking point again. They've learned a lot from the United States, haven't they?
I do agree on one thing, that I'm unhappy with the conduct of the war from the Israeli side, that it's being prosecuted way too slowly, at a very low intensity. I would call it 5 to 10% intensity. That's not how you win.
You see again? Same exact. It's like the rabbi told him exactly what to say. Same
wars. You got to fight all in. And if there's any criticism I have, it's that we're not doing this quickly enough and with enough intensity. Granted, there's tremendous pressure on Israel to slow down, but we should not cave into that pressure.
Over 40,000 people in Gaza have been killed so far. Many, many more wounded. Obviously, a number of those are Hamas terrorists. It's estimated around 15,000 or so. But that still means that well over 20,000 innocent civilians, including many children, well over 10,000 children now, have been killed. And as you know,
Lord.
Israel has been losing a lot of international support because of the way it's been prosecuting its war. Do you not have any qualms? When you talk about going harder, much harder, saying at 5-10%, if you were to go at 80-90%, presumably the death toll of civilians, if you did that, would be exponentially higher. Can Israel, and this is really the big question, I guess, can Israel continue to prosecute the war with such huge civilian life as it goes after Hamas? Or is there going to be a point when international objections to the way Israel's prosecuting it become overwhelming?
Piers, we're fighting a war against total evil that wants to annihilate us and wants to annihilate your way of living, the free world, liberal way of living. Your grandfather was a hero in the Second World War fighting in Burma against the Japanese. Was there a certain threshold of how many Japanese civilians will die, and at that point you stop the war? The West leveled 66 cities I'm not talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm talking about in conventional means. And you knew that you have to defeat Japan. You knew you have to defeat Germany at whatever price it'll take. We have to defeat Hamas at any price. The actual numbers are factually very low compared to other urban warfare. We're talking about 15,000 terrorists that have been killed. I don't believe the Hamas reports, but let's even assume that they're anything near reality. You've got about 5,000 civilians who naturally die. So we're at about a 1-to-1 ratio of combatants to civilians, which is incredibly low in urban warfare. But I can tell you, Piers, that we are resolute. We are determined to fight until we beat Hamas, and it takes time. We're not going to sit with a stopwatch and say, you know, it's been 10 months, now we stop and we let a genocidal regime continue trying to kill Israel.
But I think the big concern, Mr. Bennett, is that Israel appears to have no plan for what happens when the war ends. It's basically leveled large swathes of Gaza. A lot of the homes have been completely destroyed. 1.5 million people.
Sounds like Syria, Ukraine.
People displaced. Where are they going to go? Where are they going to live? Who's going to oversee Gaza? Obviously, you will not believe that Hamas should have any involvement in any power going forward. I would agree with that. But who is going to have power in Gaza? Who is going to run the place?
So actually, we have a fairly coherent plan for a new Gaza. The necessary condition is to fully defeat Hamas, just like Nazi Germany was fully defeated. And then we will retain security and defense responsibility for the foreseeable future so Hamas cannot arise again.
What they're describing is annexation.
At the same time, we do not want to govern the civilians in Gaza. So we will identify, and we're in the process of identifying competent local leadership that'll take care of governing Gaza. We'll bring in highly qualified people from...
Yeah, so that's a puppet state. It's annexation. It's exactly what like the Arabian Empire would do to its vassals. Same.
The Gulf, Saudis, UAE folks, whoever wants to fix it, and primarily Egyptian involvement. And we'll begin rebuilding a new Gaza, clean of terror. That's a bright future, but in order to reach that future, we have to cross the bridge, which is to fully defeat Hamas.
Natalie Bennett, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you, Piers.
Well, now to put this into perspective, returning to Uncensored, the political scientist Professor Norman Finkelstein and Israel's preeminent historian Benny Morris. Welcome to both of you. Let me ask you first of all, Norman. Well, thank you. I'm glad we brought you two together. I've got to say, a lot of people have been asking us to do this for a long time, to bring you two together. You're both very eminent historians, obviously with different perspectives on this whole conflict, which goes back to, well, decades and decades and decades, as we know. I want to start, if I may, by talking about this situation with Iran. We've just heard from Naftali Bennett there, Norman, his perspective on the fact that Iran wants to eradicate Israel and is using all its proxies to try and do this, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. That appears to be unquestionable. Do you question that premise? I mean, do you have any doubt that Iran is involved in a multi-tentacled approach of trying to destabilize and eliminate Israel?
I've actually never heard this before, but it's interesting.
It's hard to begin with a starting point, because unless you know the starting point, you can't understand what follows. But let me begin with a book that Benny Morris himself wrote. It's called Israel's Border Wars, and I highly recommend it. It's an excellent book, and it goes back to the early 1950s. At that time, the Hitler was not Iran or the Ayatollah. The Hitler back then was a fellow named Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. He was an Arab nationalist, and Israel from early on was determined to topple him, not because he was carrying on any aggressive activity against the state of Israel. as Benny Morris documents quite exhaustively, in the early years of Nasser's regime, he was focused on internal development, not on the state of Israel. But Israel always feared, and it fears to this day, that an Arab leader might modernize the state and become a threat to Israeli regional hegemony. And so from early on, as Benny Morris exhaustively documents, Israel kept provoking Nasser, until in February 1955, they carried out a major military raid, killed about 50 or 60, Professor Morris can correct me, Egyptian soldiers, and that slowly escalated until the 1956 Israeli-British-French invasion of Egypt. Now, there are two lessons to be learned.
Is this like the Suez Canal crisis that he's describing?
Number one, it had nothing whatsoever, the war had nothing whatsoever to do with Nasser's aggressive, belligerent, Hitler-like assaults on Israel. It had to do with the fear of a modernizing Egypt. That's the first lesson to be learned. The second lesson to be learned is, once Israel has a country in its crosshairs, you cannot stop it. It will keep escalating and escalating and escalating the provocations until the country is forced to react. And then once it reacts, Israel unleashes, in the case of 1956, it was together with the UK and France, unleashes its full force.
Yeah, so that's there's actually a word in Latin for this. It's called a casus belli. It's like a reason for war, right? So they provoke with the purpose of giving themselves an excuse for why they can go in and eradicate you or fight you. Interesting.
That same pattern, you saw it in 1982, when Israel kept escalating and escalating the attacks, on Lebanon until the PLO was forced to react. Israel invaded, including Benny Morris, who was a soldier during that war, committed the most horrible atrocities and killed, the estimates run, between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. The same pattern happened in 2008. There was a ceasefire in Gaza.
He's trying to destroy the guy he's arguing with, his credibility.
It was agreed to in June. Israel decided it wanted to attack Hamas.
Do we really need this distorted lecture about history?
Mr. Morris, you are not the moderator. Piers Morgan is the moderator. When he tells me to stop, I will be respectful and stop.
He's allowing you to tell people a distorted story.
Okay.
He shouldn't allow you to lecture with such distortions, supposedly based on my books.
Here's what I'll say. Benny Morris, here's what I'll say. I will absolutely give you the exact same amount of time to respond to everything that Norman is saying. I can guarantee you that. But let him just finish his point.
Okay, the same thing happened. The same thing happened in 2008. There was a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. The ceasefire was holding up. Israel decided it wanted to attack Hamas and Gaza. And so on November 4th, the day Barack Obama was elected president, when there was the distraction of the American election, the U.S. on November 4th attacked Hamas, killed several of its militants, and that quickly spiraled into the Operation Cast Lead that began on December 26, 2008. And the same thing is now happening in Iran. Iran is now in the position where Israel will keep ratcheting up and ratcheting up and ratcheting up the assassinations and the provocations until Iran is forced to react.
Okay, let me go to Benny Morris, because I mean, I would have issue with, I certainly have a big issue with the conclusion there, because it seems to me, Benny Morris, that the ratcheting up has been going on from the Iranian side. But I'll let you respond to what Norman Finkelstein just said?
Okay, I'm not going to give a lecture in history here, but Norman supposedly is basing himself on my books, and my books don't actually tell the story Norman says give. Just one or two words about the past. Nasser unleashed, allowed in the beginning, and then later organized and unleashed terrorism against Israel. He received Soviet weaponry with which to confront Israel, and Israel was felt itself forced to retaliate, to preempt him, and went into the 1956 war in alliance with Britain and France. But I won't go into the history. Listen, the main problem now isn't Nasser 60 or 70 years ago. The problem is Iran. And Iran has had a policy since the Islamic regime took over under Khomeini, and announced as well by his successor, Khamenei, still the supreme leader, to destroy Israel. That's their policy. They announce it day in, day out, not just the leaders, but the generals, everybody around power there says the same thing. Israel must be destroyed. And they want it destroyed because they are an Islamic regime. They are anti-Semites, and they want to dominate the Middle East, and they see Israel as sort of a promontory of the West in the Middle East as an enemy they have to overcome before eventually attacking the West itself. That's the bottom line for them.
I see.
Iran for decades has been building up these proxy forces, especially with rockets, especially the Hezbollah, and the Hamas. And the Hamas has been rocketing Israel for the last 2 decades. And Israel, I think, has been extremely restrained, both in relation to the Hamas and in relation to the Hezbollah, but especially, and here I think Netanyahu has been ruling Israel for about the past 15 years, has been over-restrained, if you like, weak-kneed, even cowardly, and not confronting Iran much earlier. At the moment, the Iranians are threatening revenge against Israel. The Hezbollah is threatening revenge against Israel for knocking out several of the leaders of these proxy forces, which I think Israel has every right to do and to have done. Maybe a major confrontation is on the cards between Israel and Iran. The major problem for Israel, incidentally, hasn't been mentioned, not by Norman or yourself, and that is that Iran not just wants to destroy Israel, but is busy building or trying to build nuclear weapons in order to destroy Israel. And Israel should have taken these nuclear installations out before the Iranians approached weaponization, and didn't do so, and perhaps will hopefully, if there is a major clash with Iran, will do so now and use the opportunity to destroy the nuclear installations which they built in order to weaponize and build nuclear weapons. The problem for Israel is that Israel may not have the capability to do it by itself. It may be able to damage, but it may not be able to actually destroy the Iranian nuclear project. And for that, it probably needs American help. And American presidents have been very reluctant, like Netanyahu, to confront the Iranians, and so far haven't done anything except talk about not allowing Iran to have nuclear weapons, but haven't actually done anything to stop the Iranians.
Okay, before...
You know what they say, talk is talk, you listen to the actions.
Before I go to Norman to respond to that, can I just ask you, Benny Morris, does Israel have nuclear weapons?
I don't know. I've never been invited to Dimona or wherever they stockpile them, so I don't know. But most Western intelligence agencies says Israel has a nuclear stockpile. They say Israel has at least 200 nuclear weapons, and I assume they know what they're talking about.
But we know exactly how many nuclear weapons the United States has, Russia has, China has, the UK has. Why is it the world has no idea how many Israel has? And why is it when I asked Netanyahu directly that question, he refused to answer?
Because Israel has always...
Interesting.
Had a policy of ambiguity in relation to the nuclear weapons. Israel believed that so long as it didn't announce that it possesses nuclear weapons, it wouldn't provoke other countries around to try and possess them themselves. Ambiguity was seen as the best policy. I'm not sure that was right, but that was Israeli policy.
Okay.
But I think the world,
All right.
as I said, does know that Israel does possess these weapons.
But it does. But Norman Finkelstein, it is odd, isn't it, that we just don't know? I mean, there's Benny Morris sort of casually saying that it may have as many as 200 nuclear weapons. I've certainly never heard that from any member of the Israeli government. They refuse to even acknowledge they have one.
Well, Benny Morris is an odd bird. I'm using a euphemism there, because he says one thing and then he says another thing. He's like Quicksilver. It's very hard to pin him down. So I won't go back to 1950. I won't go back to the early 50s. People can read the book, Israel's Border Wars. I read it 3 times, so I think I know it pretty well. And people can decide for themselves. Let's move to what Benny Morris just had to say. Benny Morris has, since 2008, that's the earliest date I've noticed, every 2 years he publishes an op-ed in some Western newspaper and sometimes in the Israeli newspapers, calling for an Israeli attack on Iran. Now, Benny Morris now says, we don't know whether Israel has nuclear weapons. Well, that's a very odd thing for him to say, because Benny Morris has been explicitly blackmailing the West since 2008, saying, if you don't, meaning the United States, if the U.S. doesn't join in an attack on Iran, we, meaning Israel, have no alternative except to use non-conventional, that is to say, nuclear weapons. So, if I can quote him now, it is doubtful that its conventional capabilities will be sufficient to destroy the Iranian nuclear project. Then, non-conventional weaponry will have to be used to stymie the project. And many innocent Iranians will die. But the Iranians will have brought this upon themselves by bringing to power and leaving in power a leadership that will have forced Israelis to do what was necessary in order to survive. So, Benny Morris, who doesn't know whether Israel possesses nuclear weapons, nonetheless says Israel will have to use non-conventional weapons, and he says many Iranians will have to die.
Uh-oh. Sounds like the cat's out of the bag, doesn't it? And let's end the video there. Hit the like, hit the sub, hit all the notifications. Buy my books like Hunter M, Adrian R, Tom and Bobby, Dylan, Renaissance Press, Brian, Andrew, Alan, Armani, and Nicholas. Shout outs to you, most recent purchaser of both my books, The Strategist Guide to Seduction and Codes to Live By. Thank you. If you'd like coaching like Nicholas here, just message me at theheliosblog@gmail.com. That's my email, and I'll slot you right in. And I do offer early access content on my Patreon. Thank you so much for listening, guys, especially if you listen to the end. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.